So welcome to Past and Present with Allison Gilbert and Dr. BJ Miller. My name is Dara Cosberg. I'm the program director at Reimagine, which is a nonprofit that sparks community experiences like this one that empower individuals, communities, families to face the hardest parts of our existence, including serious illness and death, while inspiring people to celebrate life and one another. And before we begin, I just have a few things. First off, I do want to thank our past and present sponsor who's really making this series possible, Domani for Grief, and you'll be hearing about them a little bit in a moment. And then I also just wanted to make sure everybody knows how to use Zoom. We are going to keep our mics off, but we encourage you to keep your cameras on just to feel more connected, but feel free to keep it off. There is, you can share comments and questions throughout the program in the chat. If it's bothering you, you can always close it by clicking that top corner. And with that, I wanted to introduce your host of the series, Allison Gilbert, who is an Emmy award-winning journalist and really one of the most, kind of influential writers on grief and resilience. She's authored numerous books, including Past and Present, Keeping Memories of Loved Ones Alive. And she serves on the board of directors for the National Alliance for Grieving Children and the advisory board for the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, which is the preeminent national organization providing grief support to families of America's fallen heroes. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Allison.
Hi, everybody. I am so glad that you are all here. If it's morning for you, where you are joining us from, good morning. You are welcome to have your orange juice, your coffee while we are talking. If it is afternoon where you are, which is how it is for me, because it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon in New York, which is where I'm joining you from, then feel free to eat your lunch while we are talking. This hour is going to be for you. It is for us. We are living through an unprecedented time. This number, 500,000, is something that has been seared on my brain and my heart. And it makes me so proud and privileged and humbled to be able to join you today. I want to first thank Reimagine for providing this unparalleled platform for all of us to come together. As Dara just said in the chat, we welcome you to take a moment, if you would like, to say in the chat where you are joining us from. I've been watching the chat already, and I see folks joining us from California to New York, to everywhere in between. I have seen Ireland overseas. We are represented across the world. I see Canada and LA and New Jersey and Brattleboro, Vermont, Maplewood, New Jersey, Washington State. I, of course, could go on, but just so you know, we may be coming together from across the country and around the world, but for this hour, I really do want to take this opportunity to say thank you for providing this opportunity to me and to BJ Miller, who you are about to see and hear from, and to thank yourself for giving yourself the opportunity for this wonderful talk, conversation, and discussion that we are going to be having. In addition to Reimagine, I do want to thank Domani for Grief. Domani for Grief is a wonderful platform. If you have not heard about Domani for Grief yet, I am here because of them. So I am grateful for their sponsorship. It is a platform where you will find courses, a blog. They have a wonderful newsletter, information resources that if you are going through your own journey involving grief, please check out Domani for Grief to help you along that path. You can find Let's Reimagine all over social media, as you know, Domani for Grief on Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn. You can find BJ Miller, who you're about to hear from, on Twitter. His ID is BJ Miller MD. So please, this is not the only time where we can connect. I invite you to follow Reimagine. Get in touch with BJ Miller on social media. Again, BJ Miller MD. And you can find me also on Instagram and Facebook at A Gilbert Writer. So that's the introduction. But I do want to formally just take a beat to just say how full of gratitude I am to BJ Miller.
Mm.
He likely does not need a formal introduction. You've probably read his recent essay in the New York Times. You've likely seen and watched and been inspired by his TED Talk that I think has been seen by I wrote it down, 12 million people at this point. But just in case you don't know who BJ Miller is, let me give you a brief summary, and we'll get more into his background as we just have this conversation. And I should say, after our formal Q&A that I will be leading with BJ Miller, please do get your questions in hand. Think about what you want to ask BJ or me. And we will have Christina, who is here joining me and is my right hand. She's going to go through the chat. She's going to identify themes of questions that keep percolating and really rising to the top. And we will make sure that as many of you are heard and that your questions are answered, as many as possible. Of course, we're not going to be able to get to every single question, which is why Christina is going to go through the chat and find those themes that seem to be really bubbling up for the group that's here today. And by the way, we've had about 800 or so folks register for today's conversation. And if you haven't been able to make it here live today, we are in fact going to be recording it. We are recording it right now, so don't worry about that. So, BJ, I am so excited to introduce you. You are a physician. Your specialty as a doctor is hospice and palliative care. We're going to talk about that. You're also the co-author of A Beginner's Guide to the End. I'm going to get the subtitle correctly, which is why I printed it out. A practical advice for living life and facing death. And you are also now the founder of a very new organization called Mental Health. And I do want to talk about mental health for a moment because it deserves everyone knowing that it's around as a resource. You've just launched it. You're offering consultations, your group, not just you, your group is offering consultations for individuals and families who are navigating their own medical decisions, choices, not just for end of life, but also what I can't wait to talk to you about too, is their thinking and their decision making around grief and remembrance. So I'm really excited to learn more about uh, mental health. So welcome, BJ.
Thank you, Allison. God, I could listen to you for a long time. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I am so glad to be with you. I'm a fan of your words. And wow, what a large group. I'm so happy to be with you all. Thank you. We are not alone, it turns out, which is
No,
great.
we are not alone. And I want, and I, by the way, we should say there's a reason why we did this as a meeting and not a webinar. So Zoom, of course, gives hosts a choice of whether or not to see only the speakers or to see the folks who are participating. And Domani for Grief, we were in a conversation with Domani for Grief about really wanting this to be an opportunity for at least us to be together and see each other, which felt like a more warm and welcoming way to have such important conversations. So if you are open to that, please turn on your camera and let's use this next few minutes, 45 minutes together to really dig in and to be there
Mm,
for each other.
mm,
So BJ, my first question to you, I have done a deep dive into your articles that you've written and to the interviews that you've given
mm,
over time, and what you talk about as the two great equalizers, birth and death. And I
mm.
want to know now, in the time of COVID, where are we, do you think, now as a world community when it comes to conversations about death and grief and how we are all grappling? This is the moment, right, when it is so universal. So I'm wondering, just to start us off, we can't ignore
Mm,
the time that we're in. So what are your
mm.
thoughts about where we are as a world community?
Well, let's see. Let's open that up. I mean, as a world community, each of us in our own state and details, of course, really matter. But as a group, as a species, as a people, I think we are in some amount of free fall, which is a sensation that comes with grief. And I also think that we're beginning to see talk about vaccinations, hospitalization rates, et cetera, coming down a little bit. We're also at this very precious, um, tender moment where we can begin to see perhaps the light at the end of this particular tunnel being the pandemic. And we should say, it's not just the pandemic that's happening. I mean, have been disrupted in many ways. Our identities around race, around class, around gender, all of it is coming up. And I don't think that's a coincidence, because we're all having basically an existential crisis, is it one way of describing it. And that's hard. But normally, when we have existential crises, we're usually by ourselves. Some detail in our life, someone was lost, we got lost. But the opportunity here, the difficulty, but also the opportunity is that we are in some amount of this stew together. And so this is where it starts to become a little bit of an opportunity. And I do want to say one thing about that too before I shut up. Is this a very tender moment where talk of returning to normal, um, this thing being over? Well, on some level, but can we go back? What the heck is normal anyway now? All our standards, everything's been disrupted. So can we go back? Do we even want to go back? So I just want to note this, because hmm, if we lurch back to try where we were before this, we will miss out on so many of the lessons that are sure to be among us. And there's an excuse for us to live a little bit differently going forward. And there's an excuse for us to revel in grief together, et cetera. So anyway, there's much to say about that, but I just want to note that let's not let this hard window close too quickly before taking stock and moving forward a little differently.
I wonder what you think about grief being the emotion that has
Hmm.
made so many of us uncomfortable prior to COVID to maybe talk about. And do you feel that one of the unintended consequences of COVID is that maybe grief is no longer as difficult to
Hmm.
vocalize and have conversations about? We're here together. There are
Hmm.
almost 300 people who have actually turned up for this conversation, more than 800 people who have
Hmm.
registered. So is that an upside? So people who are grieving, is there solace in that new sense of community?
There certainly is a great potential for it. And a lot of us have already experienced it thanks to platforms like Reimagine and conversations we're having together one way or another. Um, I think there's a maturation process happening. How we treat each other when we're aging, when we're sick, when we're dying, it can be a great tell into a society. In the West, the U.S. in particular, as a relatively young country per se, one of the ways it shows, one of our tells, is that we don't have a very fleshed out or mature notion about death or grief. It's something that we sort of keep at bay. Grief is something to kind of hurry through. Some sort of medical model will give you a few weeks to be sad, and then you're supposed to kind of pick yourself up and all this. We know that to just be grossly inaccurate and inadequate. And so, to your point, Allison, there's a moment here of pain, of course, but there is also a lot to be learning. And one of the big lessons here is grief. Grief is real, grief is essential. It is a basic human experience. It is a healing process, not something to avoid, even though it can hurt like hell. So I think we're all, in some way, maybe a quick way to say it is maybe we're growing up together a little bit.
I was struck by something that you have said, which I think will resonate and maybe jolt some people right in their
Mm,
seats listening to you today. It did me when I
mm,
came across these comments, which is that part of COVID, of course, is that folks are missing the opportunity in many cases to say goodbye to their loved ones in person. And one of the things that you said to me that struck me, not in the context of COVID, was that we actually don't have a natural right to closure,
mm,
right? It's not something that is, given to us automatically, and that somehow
mm,
we have these, if only it wasn't COVID time, or if only I could have been there for my loved one. There's this kind of imaginary thinking. And you have talked about, again, the natural right to closure is not a given, and that we need to level set, like give ourselves a reality check that
mm.
during COVID, that's one piece that may not have been different, even if there weren't COVID. And I'd love you to talk about that piece. I thought that was really
Mm.
striking.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that one up. I think that's really, really key, in part because what comes with loss very often for many of us is, you can watch our brains scramble around to make sense of all this. And we look for blame, what happened, cause and effect. That's natural. Um, but it's also us, it's a sort of a spastic endeavor. And we hunt for that narrative that we can live with. Joy, one of the joys and responsibilities of being a human being is we write those narratives. They're not necessarily sort of God or nature given. So that's difficult in that there are not sort of clear footsteps to follow to do grief well, to be good at it. There's other thing I see in myself and others is, am I doing this right? And there's almost like there's a performance to it, but that's natural. That's us being humans. That's fine. But let's just realize that the stories and narratives that we land on or search for, on some level, are made up. There are zillions of ways to look at things. We know this. So pick your story, write your story, but remember it's a story, and stories have a nice beginning, middle, and end. And you can write your story that creates closure, and that can be a very powerful thing to do. But just make sure you note it's a creation. You're not, if you don't feel closure, in other words, another way of looking at this is, if you don't feel a sense of closure, or if you feel like, I could have had closure if I could have seen my loved one, and then therefore I was robbed of closure, just soften that a little bit. There is, like you said, there is not a right to it. In one way and another, we are always left to make sense of and to accommodate things that were outside of our control. The process of making meaning or finding meaning hasn't really changed. The variables, the details have, and we have this huge, big, powerful, hard detail of not being able to be with each other in person. That's hard as hell. I'm not going to minimize that, but it's not this. Be careful to not say, if only I could have seen so and so, then everything would have been okay. I would push you to say, I highly doubt that. And again, push you back to create the story. And it's always going to involve things you can control and a lot of things you can't control. And this is one more thing on that list.
Tied up into that too is guilt, right?
Mm,
And I would love you to talk about guilt and how there's a relationship between the individual guilt, the loved one who died and how we can process and
Mhm.
take those baby steps into the future. Where does guilt come into this for you?
It's interesting. It's been coming up a lot with our clients at Mental Health recently. A lot of my conversations with people have touched on guilt, and people are smoldering with this sense of guilt. Um, and it's tricky. And of course, we're talking in generalities. There may be some things to really feel guilty about. There may be a wrong was done and there was no chance to reconcile it. There may be, guilt is also an essential human emotion. It's a natural thing. But we do funny things with guilt. It's almost like a lever. It's like there's leverage in guilt to pry ourselves forward or to pry ourselves to learn a lesson. It's a useful tool, and I'm certainly not immune to it, but it's a dirty tool. It is a heavy burn. It comes with it's like a diesel. It there's fallout. It's a rough way to go to get yourself to see, to learn, to realize your own culpability in the situation, but also where you're not culpable. Where are you not guilty? So we won't try to talk any of us out of experience of this thing that naturally occurs. But I also just want to note that it is something, especially across generations and in certain traditions, it is used. And so see it as a tool, and drop the tool if and when you can too. Regrets, guilt, things you wish you had done differently, that is normal. That's called being a human being. I've never seen a perfect death. I've never met a perfect person, unless we say we're perfect in our imperfections, which I kind of believe. So use guilt, but don't be afraid of putting it down. And let me say one more thing about that, Allison. The way it's been coming up so much for me with people is, and I watch this too, it's like, for some reason, just being sad is really hard. I don't know why. So I've seen so many families who are just sad. They just miss their loved one. That's really it. But their response to that sadness is it's intolerable. So I've got to find some, so they'll go to guilt or go to blame, often self-recrimination. Um, and that is there's something in us that really, there's something in us that wants, I'd rather hate myself on some level than just be sad. And I don't know why that is, but I see it play out a lot. So I just want to name it so we can catch ourselves.
One, thank you. One
Mm,
opportunity that I came across in my work and also in my personal life, I had lost both of my parents
mm,
relatively young. That became the springboard for why I started writing about
mm,
grief and loss and resilience and now really remembrance, right? And for me, the most powerful tool to move forward after the loss of my mother and my father, the strength that I got was in choosing to be proactive about how I keep their memory alive. So this series is
mm.
called Past and Present. It was named intentionally after my book, Past and Present, Keeping Memories of Loved Ones Alive. And I want to just pinpoint one thing that I would love you to talk about,
Mm,
which for me has been true, that when the loss of my parents was new, I was lucky in the fact that I was able to be a passive recipient of support. When
mm,
loss is fresh, people generally know, if you're fortunate, how to show up for you. They may
mm,
go to a funeral, go to a wake or a shiva, or shoot you a text or send an email or pick up the phone. For
mm,
me, what happened in the months after both of my parents died is that fewer people knew how important it was for me to keep talking about my mom and dad. And then I had kids, and to want my children to know who their grandparents are. And I say are intentionally, they still are their
mm,
grandparents, even though they passed away. And so for me, the power for healing was that pivot, a
mm,
decision that I was no longer going to be passive in accepting support about my grief, but I was going to be proactive about how I was going to keep their memory alive. And I would love you
Mhm.
to talk about remembrance traditions and where
Mm.
you see the healing value in your grief work. I know mental health is going to be consulting with individuals and families who are grieving, and I'm wondering, you have such a wonderful uh, point of view when it comes to design thinking, creativity, and intentionality. So, in that space of remembrance, I pass the baton back to you, BJ. I would
Mm.
love to hear your
Mm.
thoughts on that.
Well, I love that setup. There is something. First, I just want to say, um, with issues of health, with issues of loss, with issues of death, we suffer more if we stay in that zone. That is something that happens to us. That is nothing we can do about it, etc. Then we kind of go limp, and sometimes we're just overwhelmed. And that, okay, of course, first things first. But over time, one way and another, we have to find a way to engage our lives. We have to engage reality. That's so much of what being alive means, I think. We certainly have to engage our health. You can't just hand yourself over to the medical system or society and expect everything will just be fine. So one way or another, we have to find an active stance with our lives, even the hard stuff, maybe especially the hard stuff. So I just want to amen that setup. It's right on. Otherwise, we'll stay in victimhood, and that's not a lovely place to live for very long if we can help it. So with that, I'll also preface my comments that I've learned what the power of what you're saying the hard way, in that in losses earlier in my life with people who are close to me, such as my sister Lisa, and we can talk about her. But I turned away from her memory in a lot of ways because it was so painful, and I thought it was going to get in the way of me living on. So I turned away from those memories. I actively took down photographs. I was getting stuck in nostalgia. This was my fear. And then a few years went by of that, and I realized I couldn't. Now that I wanted to, I couldn't get to my sister. I couldn't get to the memories. It was like in a black box. I had weakened those connections unnecessarily. I thought death would cut those cords, but I've come to realize those cords don't need to be cut. They aren't really cut. To your point, it's active. Your grandparents are. My sister is. She lives in me. She lives in everyone else she ever met. That's just real. That I don't think that's a um, putting lipstick on a pig or something like that.
Hey, I want to
Yeah.
add to that. My favorite word in all of my
Mm,
work is so easy. My favorite
mm,
word is the word and,
mm,
A-N-D.
mm,
We can be sad and happy.
mm,
We can grieve and we can, find joy. We can live in this life where both are true. They're both always true. And
mm,
just because we can find happiness, find joy, and look to the future with optimism, I
mm,
don't
mm,
think that discounts the love that we have for our loved ones, the
mm,
pain that we still endure with their absence. And so I think the most
mm.
powerful word I think to remember is the word and.
Oh, that's beautiful. And it gets at what's one of the loss can feel like. It's like something's going away. It can feel like it's shrinking us, and making my life, making me smaller. But as you just put it, the and is points to actually no. If you include your emotional life, your inner life, your relation to the world around you, your place in the world, how you think of life, if you use that and instead of the but, it's such a wonderful trick in a way, because it begins to push back on this sclerosing, this I'm less than. It starts to build your capacity. I can be sad and joyful. I can miss my sister like hell and be pained by that thought. And I can love her and be so grateful I was ever with her, that I got 29 years with her, et cetera. So to your point, it's such a key idea. This is the way that loss can, in fact, maybe counterintuitively, grow us, build our capacity. We get bigger, we can hold more. And I think that's one of the great developmental points of grief.
You cracked open a window for me to talk about Lisa, So I'm going
Mm.
to continue on that
Mhm.
vein. You've talked about this openly, so I'm not speaking out of turn.
Mhm.
You lost her by suicide,
Mhm.
and I want to talk about that experience. Um, and has the world's experience of COVID and mourning at all played into how that's reactivated your feelings for missing her?
Mm. Yeah, thank you, Allison. I actually have come to love an opportunity to talk about Lisa, much by going through the lessons we talked about earlier, that I actually paid to turn towards her memory, not away from it. So thank you. Yeah, a big thing that Lisa taught me, among many other things, is that sometimes I think the sort of dominant idea of death is it's this horrible thing that may be a fact of life, but it's one that no one really wants. And we only do it because we have to. That's not really true. Um, Death can be a relief. And watching my sister, knowing her and loving her and realizing she actually chose it, certainly scrambled my notion of death and deepened it, made it more complete, more complex. So that's a big theme, and that's informed my work in a lot of ways, or how I approach my job with people. That death can mean many different things to each of us, including a relief. So that's one point. But your question about sort of activation at this time. Oh yeah, one of the things about loss is the next loss can prick scabs and can remind us of all the other losses. And on some level, early on, after my injuries, for example, I thought, oh gosh, well, the hard part, what else? No, nothing can touch me. If I can survive that and losing limbs, and then after I could survive that, then I'm untouchable. Was my thinking, because I'm scarred now. I'm good. Well, no. So then I realized I was more sensitive to pain. The next loss, it opened up all these other losses. So it pushed me to kind of push beyond any pat answers or pat thinking about grief. And it pushed me to realize that the idea here is to bend back to growing that capacity. So now, yes, I can deal with the deaths of my clients, my patients, their families, friends, strangers, 500,000 fellow Americans, etc. And it does drive me to a deeper place of sorrow, but it drives me to a deeper place is probably the better word, thanks in part to my sister's memory. And I've gotten to a point where I'm in a way grateful for that. Sorrow is not my enemy anymore. Missing her is no longer an enemy. So that took a lot of time for me personally, though.
You mentioned in your response a side comment about your limbs.
Hmm.
I didn't want to start there, but there's
Hmm.
one part of the accident that you suffered when you were a teenager and you were in college.
Hmm.
Um, for those who don't know BJ's story, I can let you recount it. But there's
Hmm.
one part of that that I do want to focus on, if you don't mind,
Sure.
which is that it was fascinating to me, your choice that you made after that horrific accident, which was to reorient what you even wanted to study while you
Hmm.
were in college, and that you became an art history major, if I'm not
Hmm.
mistaken. And in
Yep.
terms of your focus on designing a better death, thinking about creating a better path towards our grief. Uh,
Hmm.
I don't know. Maybe you can tell me that I'm wrong. Is it a stretch to say that your choice in the aftermath of your accident, your
Hmm.
changing to an art history major, all of this has been informing of your work up until now, your creation of mental health. So I'm wondering, could you recount for those who don't know,
Hmm.
if you don't mind, um,
Hmm.
what happened, the art history pivot, which I find fascinating, and where that creativity spark, how that informs your conversations about death,
Hmm.
dying, and grief. Those are three things
Hmm.
I'm throwing at
Well, lovely. You might need to remind me.
you.
but
Fair
but to
enough.
start, yeah, one of the things that's been interesting, and I don't mind talking about my injuries at all, but sometimes those, and I appreciate your making that a side entrance, because in public conversations, it ends up being sort of the focus on so many ways. And that's like, okay, to some degree. But part of the reason that's a little problematic is it's not just my story. People, yeah, I was 19 years old. I did some dumb things, got up on top of a train, commuter train, got close to the power source, and electricity arced to my watch. And that was it. I mean, so I lost both legs below the knee and one arm below the elbow. Um, but so one thing to say is, and why I appreciate your oblique entrance here, is that it's not just my story. We affect each other. We're related. It affected my friendships, my family life, in all sorts of ways. So I guess I just want to note that, apropos of nothing in particular. But so I guess I realized why I was saying that is to your point about my switching my major to art
Yeah.
history. I was studying Chinese language and East Asian studies. And while I was in that hospital bed, sitting around, wavering between horrific pain and tedious boredom, you're lying in a bed with no windows for months. It was such a wild experience. I mean, that was the first Gulf War, and I was sitting like in bed watching war on TV like it was a movie. It was a very odd time. But anyway, getting far afield here. But my point is, the decision to switch my major to studying art, when I had never had any experience as an artist or anything like that, was a hunch. And it is the one thing, is a decision I'm actually really, really proud of. So many other things, I was so lucky. I had all this love, the support, great care, etc. I can't take credit for so much of my recovery in some ways. But that choice was I will take some credit for that one. And the hunch was, I grew up with a disabled mother. I knew that my life wasn't over. I knew that disability, even though we talk about it as being less than, is actually an invitation to creativity. That adaptation, one of our great human talents, is actually a creative enterprise. And so that was such a helpful frameship for me. I wasn't going to make the best of this shitty situation, excuse my French. I wasn't just going to cop to being, I guess my life is less important now, or I'm less relevant. Or I knew, even if I felt that way, I knew better thanks to my mother's example. And switching to this creative mindset allowed me to begin to sort of take pride in my new body in a way, to see it as something to work with, to play with. Raw material for making meaning, for navigating life in an interesting way. And over time, I pretty quickly was able to go from hating my injuries to at least being like, okay, this is part of who I am now. Let's work with it. Let's play with it. Let's see where I can go. And it helped me look at my prosthetic legs as not these lame substitutes for what nature had given me. Rather, they're their own invention. They're something in of themselves.
I love what
Yeah.
you're saying because it almost sounds like that mindset is another tool in your toolbox for proactivity.
Absolutely, it is. This is where design thinking comes in. If you have a sense of, you can work inductively, have this idea of what you'd like to get to, and then you find your way to there in a creative way. You can design your way, or you can design, the sort of, okay, what do I want to work from? What's the raw material? My body, my life, my resources, my emotions, my personality, and then see what I can make from that without a goal in mind. Deductively or inductively, it works both ways. It's another way of engaging, of being proactive with your reality, and moving out of being at odds with your own reality.
I think it's the ultimate life preserver when we can collectively decide to be proactive and to reach out of our guilt, our sadness.
Mm-hmm.
All those again can be true. It's that word and, but once we can
Mm-hmm.
start clawing our way with either this artistic vision that you have or in any way that keeps those tethers to our loved ones strong, I think there's opportunity that we can claw our way into a life that is as good as it can be without that loved one in our
Mm-hmm.
presence. And so I love
Mm-hmm.
what you're saying, and I'm so grateful that we could hear a little bit more of that story.
Yeah, anytime. That whole and perspective making, the creative enterprise, I love that whole thing. We could talk for hours about it. So we can circle back if you like. But
Yeah, I would love to.
anyway.
So what I wanted to do now, because I'm very aware of everyone's time, many people are joining us in the morning before their workday really begins. Some people who are on the East Coast are joining us maybe during a lunch break. So I do want to make sure that we're going to end on time at 2 p.m. Eastern time, which leaves us a little bit more than 15 minutes right now
Hmm,
to make sure we
comes
hear
fast.
from Christina,
Mhm.
who again has been really looking through the chat, seeing which themes are really percolating to the top. And I'm going to pass the baton to Christina, who's going to help us with some questions and direct them to you, BJ. Or if there's one, Christina, that I can help answer, please let us know. But I'm sure most of them, if not all of
Mhm.
them, are going to be for Dr. Miller.
Mhm.
Okay, great. A private question that came up a lot is how do we tell people we are not okay without scaring them off?
Mm. You want me to jump in there, Allison,
Yeah,
or
for
you want to?
sure, for sure.
Yeah. Well, this is where I think it's helpful. There's probably a lot of things to say, but I think it's helpful for us to realize that we are coming out of a long stretch of not being, as a society, not giving grief much due, not, um, and keeping it pretty curtailed unnaturally, unnecessarily. So, in other words, with that backdrop, there's almost an activism to owning your own grief and saying, hey, it's my life, it's my feelings. I will find my way. I'm not going to try to standardize. I need to be done with grief at 6 months, whatever else. There, so there's a little inertia to overcome in a society that hasn't honored this process, this period of life. So know that if you're getting funny signals from the world around you, or this is where there's a little bit of courage of being an activist and owning your grief. And in a way, it's also one of the kindest things we can do for each other in society, to demand this space, so that as we rebuild our societies, we evolve, we make space for this pain, because each of us knows we may be the one in pain right now, but everyone's going to have their pain. Everyone's going to have their loss. It is a binding force. So, and that's a little bit of a backdrop to try to get in the headspace of when someone's artificially shutting your grief down or doesn't know what to do with you. Own it. You can say, and so I know I don't know what to say either about it. I just know I'm in it. I'm not feeling okay. Someday I'll be okay again, but this is going to take me some time. You can buy yourself a little space. And oftentimes just remember too that the people coming at you, they're usually projecting their own fears onto you. It may come off as judgment of what you should be doing with your grief, but it's really most often their own fears. And that way you might have even a little compassion for folks when they have no idea what to do with you.
I agree. And I would also add one thing before Christina, you go on to the next question, which is that finding a free discussion platform like you have already done today
Mm,
is perhaps where you need to get the kind of support that
mm,
maybe your closest friends, maybe your spouse, maybe your sibling is ill equipped to provide. And
mm,
so just because people are supposed to be the ones who are closest to you, that you think they should be giving you what you need, sometimes the opportunity is with strangers,
mhm.
and to open yourself
Yeah.
up to that possibility that the support you need may not be those people who are actually closest to
Mm,
you by friendship or by blood.
mm, mm,
Christina, I'll stop talking now.
Okay,
mm,
so we got a lot of questions in the chat about people who felt like they didn't get closure because there were two options in the chat that happened. A lot of people didn't get closure because of COVID and because they lost family members to suicide. And they're struggling with dealing with the why question, why did this death happen? And feeling guilty about what their relationship was with that person and how things ended. So do you have
mm.
anything to say about how to handle those feelings?
I guess that goes right to that second question I asked you,
Mm.
BJ, which
Yeah.
is we don't have a natural right to closure. Maybe you can
Mhm.
expand upon that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so much is, answering your own questions of why and why not. Um, this is, again, realizing that if you can find closure, that's wonderful. But seeing it as a creation, you know, um, that may fall on deaf ears right now. You may be overwhelmed by feeling like you should have done something different, etc. So it's natural. But I just want to remind you again that there's if I've seen some of the most exquisitely beautiful deaths where family all do gather around, are present, put their own stuff down, reconciled, said, I love you, said, I'm sorry, said, thank you, did everything right in this way. And in the end, still we're left fighting, if only I had done that. And why didn't I do this? And if, gosh, now I remember mom said this. And if I had, and she must have thought of this about me. And that is just, that is natural. So you're gonna, so I don't have much more to say. And I wonder if you do, Allison, except to just give yourself all that space and know that someday, if you find closure, you will have made it yourself. And in the end, too, of my own seeking for closure, in the end, I've often found myself back to wanting to pry open, to perforate the closure line, actually, to let it bleed across. And in this way, death and life can be folded into each other, which is another way of saying, which is so much the point.
I would add one thing, and it's
Mm,
informed by the work of Dr. Robert Niemeyer.
mm,
Dr. Robert Niemeyer is someone who I very much look up to in this work, and he talks a lot about the power of writing a letter. Um,
mm,
what he says about letter writing to somebody, and you may never, of course, send it if that person is deceased, if that's who you want to write to, is that
mhm,
letter writing is one of the only tools we have, perhaps he would say the only one, where we can restore, in this way, a fabricated restoration of the dialogue that we miss with our loved one. That when we
mhm,
write our thoughts down, we imagine what our loved one might say in response. And in
mhm,
that way, we recreate this conversation that no other tool can do after a loved one dies. And so, one other opportunity could be, if it's comfortable for you, is writing a letter that, of course, you'll never send, but it's a way of releasing and acknowledging and finding some sort of clarity um, as you go ahead and commit your words to a screen if you're tapping it out on your phone, or to writing if it's on a piece of paper. But Dr. Robert Niemeyer is a
mm.
wonderful resource when it comes to understanding the power of letter writing.
That's beautiful. I'm so glad you brought us down into the practical. And I saw one of the comments go by underneath a note about self-compassion. Boy, is that a key thing to learn. I think a lot of us are good at giving love, taking it, receiving it, whether from ourselves or others, is so much is difficult. But boy, what an excuse to learn that. And I will say one more thing about that, ritualizing it. So with my sister, now for whatever reason, I just chose, whenever I see, if it's 222 or 111, I see the same numbers at time. For whatever reason, that's why that I'm connected to my sister. I think she's here. I talk to her in that moment. I feel like when I look at the clock and see those, that somehow, I'm not even sure if it's a signal. It's just my way of noting this relationship and speaking to it. So,
Before Christina, thank you. Before you go on, Christina, I know we have 9 minutes left.
mm,
Before anyone jumps off the line, I wanted to remind you that even though we've had this hour, if you have to jump, the full recording will be made available to you. The conversation doesn't even have to end now. You can stay in touch with Reimagine online.
mm.
Domani for Grief, of course, is on Facebook and Instagram. Dr. Miller is on Twitter. You are prolific on Twitter, and your handle is BJ Miller MD. Is that right?
Yep. BJ Miller was taken, so I had to put the MD in. Yeah.
And of course you can stay in touch with me too, which is A Gilbert Writer. I just wanted everyone to really own the fact that just because we're going to end in 8 minutes, it always feels abrupt when these conversations do come to an end. I just wanted everyone to feel that there's an avenue for continuing to have these discussions. So I'm going to send it back to Christina. Hopefully there's 1 or 2 more questions we have time to take before BJ has to go off. But I wanted to just remind people that we could stay connected after this discussion is over. So Christina, let me know what is the next question for Dr. Miller.
Okay, this one I think is actually great for you, Allison. I know you've written about it before. How do you manage feelings of jealousy, such as jealousy of seeing others enjoy parents helping out with their kids, etc.?
Yeah, unfortunately, there was a passage in my book, Parentless Parents, that I look back now and boy, was that raw what I wrote. I'll be very honest with you. I wrote this book, Parentless Parents, and it was about my experience raising my 2 children without my own parents there to be babysitters. And that was just, in the most practical sense, really hard. I wanted more support and I wanted advice about when my kids were going to walk, because that's hereditary. And I wanted them to answer questions that the parenting books couldn't answer because things were particular to my gene pool. And I didn't have my mom and dad to ask those questions. And I was ravingly jealous of friends who had their parents, and it would make my blood boil. I must admit, it's not pretty that I didn't have that level of support. And so what did I do? I found support by being proactive anywhere else I can go find it. And it took time and courage. So I started having babysitting time swaps with friends, and not because they asked me to do that kind of babysitting swap. It's because I needed the respite. I needed the time. And so again, it's going back to really being honest with yourself with what you need. And if you can get what you need at the core, it allowed me to let go of some of that, I'll call it resentment. It wasn't just jealousy. It allowed me to let go. I'm not proud of those emotions, but the more that I attended to my own scaffolding and I admitted to my own needs, I was able to let go of the jealousy and the resentment that I did have for what I was missing. And the realization was that I was never going to get my mom back, and I was never going to get my dad back. So those ships had sailed. And so how was I going to do the best by me and the best by my 2 small children at that time to get the help that I so wanted? And that's just one thing, right? The babysitting help was just one aspect of it, but maybe the most practical. And so it's creating my own scaffolding, which I think is really the point of my response. Thank you, Christina.
And I think this might be our last question. A lot of people asked about resources for support. Maybe BJ, you can talk about mental health, but we also had a question for people that work in hospice centers or hospitals, and where those staff members could get resources for feeling burnout or anxiety.
Well, so mental health, that's my little outfit. And it's spelled METTLE, mentalhealth.com. It's online palliative care counseling and coaching, and all are welcome. Patients, caregivers, but also professionals. We see some of our clients are professionals who are dealing with burnout or their own grief. So all of the above are welcome. So that's one outlet. We're online. There are others, of course, too. Reimagine is something to put on your radar if it's not already. EOL is a network. The End of Life, EOL, is also a network of people coming together, resources being shared, etc. Ways to get good information. Librarians are amazing resources, especially if you're around a health university. Like a health sciences librarian can help you find all sorts of amazing things. What else should I think here?
I would just add that it's
Mm,
growing and it's evolving and it's a forward-facing platform that's going to be improving every single day. But thanks to Damani for Grief for
yeah,
having
thank
this
you.
event. But Damani for Grief is going to be it's evolving to become, it's in process of, but already there are courses that folks can take advantage of. There's a blog, there's a newsletter, there's a way of getting information, and that platform will only improve, I think, in the days and months to come. And so that's a wonderful resource. And I think that, gosh, aren't we lucky to live today when at the fingertips we can find those resources that we most need? And I'm so glad, BJ, that you have founded Mental Health. I think that could have been an
Mm,
incredible resource for me when my parents were both sick and dying. I think that that would have been a phone call that I would have really taken advantage of. So, wow, that's amazing.
Thank you, Allison. We're glad to be doing it. Yeah.
So we have 2 minutes left, Christina. How about we do one last question before we sign off, and we thank Reimagine again for being the best hosts ever and providing the best platform ever. So let's do one more rapid fire question for BJ, Christina. I think you're on.
Sorry, I
Oh, there
was
you go.
muted. Still not used to Zoom. This question's from Bill. Could you speak on continuing bonds?
Continuing bonds.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, one of the opportunities of this isolation, I think, has been pointing us inward as we're not able to be outward with with each other. So hopefully a lot of us are more in touch with our inner life. And in there, you will find bonds, you will find connections. They may not be physical ones per se. There may not be literal strings attached, but there are emotional, psychological, developmental strings. So these bonds, like we've been saying, they get to keep going, and you can shape them. You can be proactive with them. You can point them where you want to go. And on that note, it's also relates to sort of what to do with lack of closure. One other thing that came to mind is as you communicate, as you travel that bond between you and the person lost, oftentimes it might be helpful if you're feeling guilty, if you're feeling out of sorts, you can ask that person what they would say to you. Most of us know, I know what my sister would say to me. She would say, "Forgive yourself, BJ. I love you. It wasn't your fault that I left this planet." I know what she would tell me. So anyway, you can traverse these bonds as ways to find closure, as ways to stay alive in your memory with people, to stay active in your own reality.
Thank you, BJ, for that explanation. Continuing bonds is a whole other
Mm,
category, a discussion platform that is one of my favorites. And so maybe we can
mm,
do a whole other event one day just about continuing bonds. And so I appreciate that question so much, but I do want to honor everyone's time. We are right on the nose. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today for the launch of the Past and Present event series. It has come to you, it's coming to you by Reimagine and Damani for Grief. We will be back next month. It'll be the last Thursday of every month at the same exact time. So look out for emails, and I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks again, BJ.
mhm. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Damani. Thank you, Reimagine.